Shabbat Shalom, everyone. So good to see you all on this beautiful San Antonio evening. Friends, I've been thinking it's been a while since I've told you a good PetSmart story here at Shul. And I know that you all just love when I talk about my college days playing pet store. So walk with me down memory lane for a moment while I regale you with a tale about an event that would happen about every 6 months at my beloved corporate pet franchise, a day in which we all dreaded, a day called Inventory Day. Now, for those of you who have never worked retail, first of all, mazel tov. But secondly, you might not be aware, or you might have not ever thought about the fact that everything in a retail store is kept in an account log to document how much of that item has been sold or returned, or in some cases, stolen. And every 6 months, the pet store I worked at would hire an outside team of people to come in, usually during closing hours, and they would count every item in the storefront and in the back warehouse as well. That's right. Every bag of kibble, every box of kitty litter, every dog collar, and every chew toy would be counted, logged, and inputted into some big mysterious system that was way beyond my pay grade. But what you might not have ever thought about is that in a pet store, some of the goods that we sold were called live product because they were animals. So that means every hamster and gerbil, every parakeet and pigeon, every goldfish and every guppy, heck, every cricket and every worm had to be counted, logged, and inputted. Now, because this outside team that the pet store hired to count merchandise was not always keen on counting things like snakes, PetSmart insisted that its own employees of the pet care department had to handle this aspect of inventory, and guess which department I worked in? So once every 6 months, my manager would summon us all to the store as we were closing, and we would be assigned the sacred task of counting. Now, from the offset, this doesn't seem so hard. In fact, it's pretty easy to count a guinea pig, 1. But have you ever tried to count several dozen parakeets in a cage that fly around erratically the moment you open the door? Have you ever looked into a fish tank, which can sometimes hold literally hundreds of minnows, and tried to count them? Spoiler alert, they don't keep still. Friends, we would order crickets by the thousands to sell to people who wanted to feed them to lizards or frogs, and I would have to stand there like an idiot. 1, 2, 3, We also, the pet care team, learned very quickly that the outside team that was hired to count the other merchandise, they could do this after the store closed, and therefore they could take their precious time counting, because they got to go home and sleep once they were done. But because we worked at that very store, it was not uncommon to count all night and then be scheduled to open the store the next morning at 6 a.m. So we decided that we were going to begin our count during business hours, which is all fine and good, except for the fact that there were customers who, go figure, needed help. So I'd be in the middle of counting 400 goldfish, 206, 207, only to be interrupted by a guy who said, "Can I get a price check on this catnip?" One time, I spent about an hour counting all the crickets, which, keep in mind, there could literally be thousands of. And when I recorded the number, the store manager looked over my shoulder and said the current inventory had a count that was off by 38. and he made me recount them all over again, which I did. However, this time, when I recorded the number, he came back and said it was off by 26. And then he told me I had to recount them a third time. Friends, I almost committed a violent crime at the pet store that day. I remember when he asked me to do it again, I was so furious and just exhausted and numb from counting that I screamed, "This is absurd! They're just crickets!" To which he responded, "Jonathan, the least countable things matter too." And you know what? As ridiculous as it sounded to me at the time, standing there exhausted and covered in cricket dust, he was right. Because that's exactly the idea at the heart of this week's Parshat. Our Torah portion, Bemidbar, or Numbers, begins the book of the Torah with the same name. And it opens with a census of the Israelites, the Jewish people. Tribe by tribe, family by family, person by person, the Torah demands that they all be counted. Now, on the surface, this sounds administrative or bureaucratic. Ancient spreadsheets in the desert, really, God? But if this census were only about military strength or productivity or usefulness, then the Torah could have stopped with the fighting men, the men of military age who could serve in battle. But it doesn't stop there. The Torah turns its attention to the tribe of Levi, and we're told that the Levites were to be counted separately. Now that is interesting, because the Levites were not warriors. They were not the ones carrying swords and shields into battle. They were the caretakers, the singers, and the guardians of our sacred space. And then the Torah says something extraordinary. The Levites are to be counted from the age of 1 month old and upward. 1 month old? Obviously, they aren't even old enough to fight, not old enough to work, not old enough to contribute really in any measurable way. And yet, they still counted. They still mattered enough to be named, enough to be noticed, enough to belong. Friends, we live in a world that is obsessed with counting people according to what they produce, what they earn, how successful they are, how efficient they are, or how many followers they have on Instagram, or how much they can contribute. But the Torah teaches a radically different lesson. A person's value is not determined by their utility, and holiness is not measured in productivity. The Torah counts the people who might otherwise be overlooked: the infant, the non-soldier, the tribe assigned not to conquer but to care for one another. And maybe that's why this Parsha matters so much to us now. Because there are moments in every person's life when we feel like crickets in the inventory. Moments when we think, I'm insignificant, or what I do doesn't matter, or even no one would notice me if I weren't there. Friends, there are people sitting here tonight who quietly make this community possible, and some of us don't even know their names. Maybe this is the person who calls another congregant after surgery, or the person who helps set up our kiddush lunch, or the person that shows up every week to ensure that we have a minyan so that other people can say Kaddish if they need to. And the world might not count those things. The Torah does. Why? Because like my manager said, the least countable things matter too. I thought my manager was talking about crickets, but I think Bemidbar is trying to teach us something deeper. In the eyes of Hashem, there are no insignificant people. There are no insignificant souls. Every person carries divine worth simply because they are. And every act of kindness counts, and every prayer counts, and every quiet moment of compassion counts. And maybe our sacred task as a community is to become better at counting one another the way the Torah counts, not by usefulness, but by preciousness. So in conclusion, yes, friends, you got another pet store sermon tonight. And yes, I got a handful of laughs, but that's always better than making a joke and just hearing crickets. Shabbat shalom.